Without any further ado, Joshua Oppenheimer, and welcome to Northwestern.
Well, I do want to make this as much as possible just a dialogue with you about the film, and you ask questions and I answer anything you might want to know. But I thought I would just say a little bit about how these two films came to be, how I came to work in Indonesia, and what their life has been in Indonesia since finishing them. I first went to Indonesia in 2001. I was asked to help a group of plantation workers, to teach a group of plantation workers how to make their own film, in which they would document their struggle to organize a trade union in the aftermath of the Suharto dictatorship, under which unions were effectively illegal. And I found myself on a Belgian-owned oil palm plantation, knowing nothing about Indonesia, not yet speaking the language, in a region of Indonesia that foreigners really would never visit. And on this Belgian plantation, this Belgian oil palm plantation, the women workers were given the supposedly lighter work of spraying the pesticides and the herbicides. And this may have indeed been physically lighter if they were physically easier if they had been given also protective clothing, but they hadn't been. And the women who had this job were dying of liver failure in their 40s. And one of the first things we did was to try and understand which chemical was responsible for the women getting sick and dying. And once we figured it out, we were able to identify one herbicide in particular. The workers approached the company and demanded the protective clothing that would prevent them from dying on the job. And the company responded by hiring a paramilitary group, Pancasila Youth. In fact, they couldn't do that directly. They had to do that through the military. So they went to the military, who in turn, on their behalf, hired Pancasila Youth. And that's the paramilitary organization, if you've seen my first film, The Act of Killing, at the center of that film. And Pancasila Youth was hired to threaten and attack the workers, who dropped their demands, saying to me, "We know this is a matter of life and death for us, but we're afraid that if we pursue this, things could get much, much worse." Because in 1965, there was a mass killing here, and our parents and grandparents, without exception, were members of the National Plantation Workers Union, as was every plantation worker in Indonesia. And we're afraid that, and because of that, because they were members of the union, they were seen as likely opponents of the new military regime which was coming to power, and they were killed. And we're afraid that if we pursue this could happen to us, because this paramilitary group, Pancasila Youth, is still powerful in this region and was the main organization to carry out the killings with the army in this region. And so we're dropping this. And at that point I realized what was killing my friends was not just poison, but also fear. And what was keeping everything they produced, everything made with palm oil, cheap, from biofuels to soap, to skin cream, to potato chips, what's keeping it cheap is not just poor labor conditions, but also fear. And what's keeping everything produced in Indonesian sweatshops and factories cheap is ultimately fear. And we are the unwitting consumers of this fear. And that these thugs from Pancasila Youth are ultimately, unfortunately, paid for by us. And they're working for us. And realizing this, being haunted by this, when the plantation workers said, "Please, when we finish our film, you come back and make your own film about why we're still afraid," I had to return. So the plantation workers finished their film. It's called The Globalization Tapes. Actually, you can see it on YouTube. And I went back immediately after they finished in early 2003 to start making a film about the terrible legacy of what I now understood to be a genocide for nearly 40 years on. How people could still be living in fear nearly 40 years on. And when I returned, immediately I was introduced to Ramli's parents, because in fact the grave that Rohani and Adi visit in the Look of Silence is located in the middle of that oil palm plantation where I first arrived in Indonesia. And I arrived, and suddenly, I returned back to the plantation. immediately was introduced to Ramli's parents, Rohani and Rukun. And the reason it was inevitable, I suppose, and the reason I was introduced to them right away was because on that plantation, and for actually a 20-mile radius, the name Ramli had become synonymous with the genocide as a whole. And that's because Ramli's murder was one of the only murders that had witnesses, and to my knowledge, in fact, the only murder with a marked grave. There were many people who were dumped in mass graves, and those that were sort of rumored, where there were rumors that here was a mass grave or here was a mass grave. But Ramli's murder was the only, was the only victim who ultimately had a marked grave. And the vast majority of the victims, tens of thousands, were killed at rivers like Snake River, and their families were, their bodies were thrown in the rivers, allowed to drift out to sea, and their families never told what happened, which meant that their families couldn't grieve, they couldn't mourn, because they couldn't even say that their loved ones had died. Because to say that would be to acknowledge, would be to give up the hope, the maybe ever fading but never quite vanishing hope that they might one day come back. And so instead of saying that their loved ones had died, even in 2003, they were saying, Mereka belum pulang, or they haven't come back yet. They haven't come home yet. So although they couldn't give expression to their own grief, the grief that had upended their own families, they could talk about Ramli, because his murder had witnesses. And somehow, over the decades, talking of Ramli became a kind of synonym for the killings as a whole across this region, as families found it possible to talk about that one murder. So I was introduced to Ramli's mother, Ramli's father, and fell in love with them immediately. Rukun was not yet, Ramli's father was not yet suffering from dementia. And they in turn wanted me to meet right away Adi, saying that he was a replacement for Ramli. They were able to continue living because they had him in 1968. And they said, you must meet him. He looks like Ramli, acts like Ramli, talks like Ramli. He is essentially Ramli. I think they saw him really as a reincarnation of Ramli. And they called him to the village, and I met this young, brilliant, gentle man who was desperate to find out what had happened. He'd heard from his mother morning, noon, and night, as he would put it later, the story of how Ramli was murdered. And he heard the government propaganda celebrating the killings in school. It's something that, if you've seen the director's cut of The Act of Killing, there's a propaganda film that every child had to watch every year in school. That came out when Adi was in junior high school. And he couldn't connect this stigmatizing, terrifying propaganda, something that I ultimately realized is a kind of, it's the same story in that propaganda film that you see being taught to Adi's son in The Look of Silence in school, just graphically depicted in a film. It's essentially a history lesson masquerading, it's essentially incitement masquerading as a history lesson, as it sort of incites the whole society to continue to suspect and hate the victims of the genocide. In any case, Adi couldn't figure out really how to connect the lies he was being taught in school, which he felt were lies. There was no relationship between them and his mother's experience, and the story of his brother's murder. And he, seeking answers, trying to understand what happened to his family, to his village, to his country, he started to gather survivors to tell me their stories. And after 3 weeks, the army found out what we were doing, because the survivors were still decades on, 40 years on, still under surveillance. The army threatened the survivors not to participate in the film. And so Adi and the other survivors called me to a midnight meeting in his parents' home, where they said, please don't give up, try to film the perpetrators. Well, I was afraid to approach the perpetrators at first. It seemed dangerous, it seemed also sort of foolhardy, and I also wondered why the survivors would want me to speak to really their opponents in this history, the people who'd oppressed them. But they convinced me to try. I overcame my fear, I approached them, and I discovered this horrific boasting. And the very earliest material that I shot with the perpetrators, you see in The Look of Silence. Adi, the other survivors, and ultimately the whole Indonesian human rights community, or much of the Indonesian human rights community, wanted to see that material I was shooting, and we first in the village, and then ultimately in Jakarta, human rights organizations' offices, would screen that material, and everyone who saw it would urge me to continue filming the perpetrators. They would say, you're onto something terribly important, keep filming the perpetrators. Anyone who sees this material will be forced to acknowledge that in a terrible and important way, the genocide hasn't ended. Because the army, water. That would be helpful. That would be great. The survivors urged me when they saw the material, keep filming the perpetrators, because anyone who sees this will be forced to acknowledge that in a terrible and important way, the genocide hasn't really ended. Because the perpetrators are still in power, survivors' lives are still being ruined by fear. And actually, in the case of those plantation workers, people were still being killed, I think, as a result of fear. And so I felt from that point on, early 2003 on, April 2003, I felt entrusted by the survivors to do a work that clearly they could not safely do themselves. The human rights community in Indonesia couldn't do it itself, and to film the perpetrators. And I spent the next 2 years filming every perpetrator I could find, working my way up the chain of command from this small plantation village to the large city of Medan, where I went on to make the act of killing, and beyond, to retired army generals living in Jakarta, to retired CIA officers and State Department officials living outside Washington, D.C. And everyone was boastful. Everyone was eager to show me what they've done, would take me to the places they killed, launch into spontaneous demonstrations of how they killed. 8 months into this 2-year period of filming every perpetrator I could find, I got over my fear of bringing two perpetrators together. It was something that seemed like it could be dangerous, because one could tell the other, you shouldn't talk about this, and the whole process could stop just as we were getting started, or worse, we could all be arrested, which would be unfortunate for me, but could be terrible for my Indonesian team. But after 8 months, I had to understand, are they boasting only for me? Is it because I'm American? Is it because I have a camera and it's out of vanity that they're boasting? Or would they speak this way with each other? And I took the risk of bringing two perpetrators together who didn't know each other. This is January 2004. And filmed a scene that would really lead me to make both of these films. And that's the scene where Amir Hassan and Inon take me to Snake River and take turns playing victim and perpetrator, lead me down to the spot where they helped kill 10,500 people. Amir Hassan reveals that he actually was involved with killing Ramli, something I had no idea before he said it. And then at the end, produce a camera and pose to take pictures. And in that quiet moment, when they stop to smell the flowers along the dirt road, and then help each other down that grassy slope, gently help making sure the other doesn't slip, and being very human with each other. In that moment, I had a moment to think. The rest of the time when they were talking, I was straining not to cry, not to panic, I was just struggling to keep my composure. But in that moment when they helped each other down the slope, I thought to myself, for the first time, and I would think this many times since, it's as though I've wandered into Germany 40 years after the Holocaust, only to find the Nazis still in power. If the rest of the world had celebrated the Holocaust, even participated in the Holocaust while it took place, which accounts for their shamelessness when speaking to me, an American. And that evening I went home, and I noted in my diary that I should make two films. One about the lies, the fantasies, the boastful performance of the perpetrators, and the other about what is it like to live surrounded by those perpetrators. And if the first film, The Act of Killing, if the first film was made with the perpetrators, that's obviously out of necessity. And if it's ultimately a kind of flamboyant fever dream of a film, I suppose that's because it deals with the lies, the fantasies, the stories the perpetrators have to tell themselves so they can live with themselves, and the horrible consequences of those lies when imposed upon the whole society. In that sense, it is a kind of film about escapism and guilt. And then the second film, it's really, I think, no less experimental. It's just less flamboyant. It's a kind of poem, I hope, composed in memoriam to all that's destroyed. And it's not just the dead, who will never be one can never bring back, but also the lives broken by fear and silence. And it's really asking, what does it do to human beings to have to live in such a society ruled over by the victorious perpetrators? What does it do to human beings to have to live for half a century afraid? What does it do to a family? What does it do to memory? What does it do to our ability to mourn, to heal? And that's, of course, the look of silence. I spent the next year and a half after that January 2004 shoot at the river, continuing to film every perpetrator I could find. The 41st perpetrator was a man named Anwar Congo. And I lingered on him because I saw that his pain was not only close to the surface, but that he was boasting in response to the pain. That the boasting for Anwar Congo, and I gradually started to realize for everybody else, might not really be pride, but the opposite, a defensive attempt to insist to himself above all that what he did was right, so that he could live with himself. I started to wonder whether boasting and remorse might not be two sides of the same coin. And I spent the next 5 years working with Anwar Congo, exploring that, making the act of killing. And throughout that time, Adi would watch everything I had time to show him. He would come over every night throughout the shooting and ask to see our footage. And at the end of shooting the act of killing in 2010, I gave Adi a small camera that I hoped he would use as a kind of notebook to look for images that might inspire the making of The Look of Silence, which of course I always knew I would return to make. I went back to Europe to edit the act of killing, and Adi would send me tapes. And when I returned to Indonesia, when I finished editing the act of killing in 2012, early 2012, I returned to Indonesia before the act of killing had its first screening, at which point I knew I would not be able to return safely to the country for a very long time. And Adi said to me right away, I've spent 7 years watching your footage with the perpetrators. It's changed me. I need to meet them, especially the men who killed my brother. And I said instantly, reflexively, absolutely not. It's too dangerous. We cannot do it. There has never before been a film where survivors confront perpetrators who still hold a monopoly on power. We can't do it. And Adi then produced this camera. He said, wait a moment. He went to the back of his house and got the camera that I'd given him in one tape. And said, I'm sorry I never sent you this tape, it's very personal to me, and I want to hold on to it. And he put it in the camera and pressed play and proceeded to show me the one scene in The Look of Silence that Adi shot. And it's the scene at the end where his father's crawling through the house calling for help. And as soon as it started playing, he started to cry, and he said this was the Eid al-Fitr holidays, the end of Ramadan. And the whole family was together, and frankly, I just brought the camera along to make a home video. But it was the day we all got together, it was the first day my father couldn't remember anyone in the family. He didn't know who any of us were. And he was confused and felt he was in a stranger's house all day, and we would try and comfort him. And because he's so hard of hearing and nearly blind, the only way we could get his attention in his raving was to touch him, and we would try to be as gentle as possible. But when we would put our hands on him, he would shriek with fear. And we would back off, he said. And the rest of the family would go in the other room. But Adi couldn't bear being in the other room, knowing his father was crawling through the house, crying for help. And so Adi stayed with him, but Adi found he couldn't stand just watching his father crawling and crying out and not being able to help and not knowing what to do. And he had the camera with him because he didn't want the children to damage it. So I think eventually, I think to protect himself from the kind of pain of this, he started to film. And he said, the moment I started filming this, I realized I was documenting the day that it becomes too late for my father to heal. Because he's forgotten the son whose murder has destroyed my family's life, his life especially, but he hasn't forgotten the fear. And he'll now never heal, he'll never work through this fear because he can't remember what happened. And he said, I don't want, and then we watched the scene play out in silence. And when it was done, through tears, he said, I don't want my children to inherit this prison of fear from my father, my mother, and from me. And I think as a parent, I owe it to my children to try and approach the perpetrators and show them that if they can just acknowledge what they've done was wrong, we can forgive. And he thought that they would welcome this as an opportunity to be forgiven by one of their victims' families and to make peace with their neighbors and to stop this frantic, defensive boasting. And I was very moved. I talked to my Indonesian crew, and they said, you know something, Joshua, the production of the act of killing was famous across this region of Indonesia. And if you've seen the act of killing, you'll notice that you'll remember that there's a state television, a regional state television talk show produced to celebrate the production of the film. It was a big deal that the vice president, and is again the vice president now, and the national leader, the leader of the national paramilitary movement, and the governor, and ministers and members of parliament were working with me to make a film. And because no one had seen the film yet, everyone in North Sumatra believed I was still friends with these men. And so, while I am still friends with Anwar Congo, or close to Anwar Congo, and actually to Herman Koto as well, the two sort of main characters in the act of killing, the rest of all of those powerful men in the film hate me, surely, and see me as hate me, as they should. And so my crew said, you see, the men Adi wants to confront are regionally but not nationally powerful. And they will not dare even detain you, let alone physically attack you, because they'll be afraid of offending their superiors whom they think are your friends. So you can, in fact, confront these men. And I went back to Adi and I said, okay, it might be possible to confront them. We have to take pains we have to talk to your family about what we're doing before we take any risk. And indeed, the two scenes in the film where you see him telling his mother and his wife what happened are a little bit out of sequence, because for you as a viewer, for you as an audience to understand the risk that Adi's taken, we found that you needed to see him be threatened first once. But in fact, we shot one confrontation with Enom, the man with the red glasses, and we knew that he lived in a very remote spot and had terrible relationships with all of his superiors. They didn't like him. They thought he was obnoxious. And you'll also remember that Adi never tells Enom who his brother is. So there was no risk we took filming that confrontation. And then Adi told his mother and his wife what happened. They reacted as you saw in the film, but then, you don't see this in the film, we showed them that footage so they could see what it looked like. And they both said, okay, this is potentially very important. This dialogue is exactly what's been needed for someone to say this for half a century. If there's a way of doing this safely, maybe we can continue. And so at that point, we then found ways of doing the rest of the confrontations as safely as possible, which included having a getaway car so that as soon as we were done shooting, Adi could go to the car and drive off, unbeknownst usually to the perpetrator, while we would break down the equipment, and we'd have Adi's family at the airport ready to evacuate if anything went wrong. So I explained to Adi, when I told him we could try this, that we would have to get his family's consent, we might have to abandon the project at any time, and we might not be able to release the film at all unless we could find a way of doing it that we all felt was truly safe and that the family was comfortable with. And I also warned Adi, I said, and if you're comfortable with all of that, I have to tell you, I don't think you'll get the apology you're hoping for. If you've seen the uncut act of killing, the director's cut, between the two bouts of retching at the end of the film, Anwar says, why did I have to kill? I killed because my conscience told me they had to be killed. That is to say, even when he's choking on his own guilt, he can't bring himself to admit that at the time he always knew it was wrong. And I felt if we couldn't get there in 5 years with Anwar Congo, we certainly won't get there in an hour and a half with Adi. I later came to understand, as I saw the way Adi approached the perpetrators, that Adi's humanizing gaze, the way he looks at these men as human beings, saying, if you can just admit it was wrong, I can forgive, that doesn't make it easier for the perpetrators. It makes it harder, because they're forced to return his gaze and see him as a human being. It's a simple kind of, especially since very often he's just tested their eyes, which has established an intimacy. They're forced to see him as a human being. And then they're forced to see Ramli as a human being. And by extension, they're forced to see all of their victims as human beings, and all of the lies that they've told themselves for 50 years, justifying what they've done, have been predicated on dehumanizing their victims. And their whole self-conception falls into crisis. And I think they panic, they get guilty, they feel angry, which is always our response to guilt. You know, you see people will sometimes see my films and see the look of silence and see the perpetrators get angry and say, oh, see, they feel no remorse. But how often have you been confronted by somebody whom you know you've hurt, and your first response in reaction to guilt is to get angry? It is the human response to guilt. So I realize that the perpetrators react with guilt, with anger, with panic. And I told, maybe not quite understanding why that would happen, I told Adi, if I can film with precision and intimacy the very inevitable human reactions that will come when you go into someone's home and say, hey, you've killed my brother, can you take responsibility for this? Even if these confrontations fail, if I can film why they fail, we'll be making visible this abyss of fear and guilt that's dividing everybody. Unspoken, unacknowledged, often unconscious. And we'll be able, hopefully, to make anyone who sees this film, this series of failures that shows how you cannot have truth and reconciliation without a collective social process. You cannot have a one-person truth and reconciliation commission. If I can show that, we can make anyone who sees the film long for the process that would be needed for Adi to succeed. We can make anyone who sees the film understand how urgently Indonesia needs truth, justice, and reconciliation, whatever that might look like. And in that sense, I told Adi perhaps we would succeed in a bigger way through the film, even if we fail in the individual confrontations. We proceeded, we shot the film, we were able to get through it safely. When I had a rough cut of the film, just after the act of killing had been at the Academy Awards, when I had a rough cut of the film, we all met right after the Oscars in Thailand, and this was in April 2014. And we were in Thailand because I still couldn't safely return to Indonesia. I went, Adi's family came, some of the crew from both films came, and the team that released the act of killing in Indonesia came, which included a number of prominent Indonesian human rights advocates. And we gathered in Thailand and watched the rough cut of The Look of Silence, and I prefaced it by saying, watch this film and consider whether we should not release the film until either the perpetrators have died, who are in the film, or there's been more political change in Indonesia, or if we should release the film and Adi and the family, I'm afraid if we release it, you would probably have to move to Denmark, where I live, for as long as necessary. And we watched the film, and the immediate reaction was this film has to come out now, from especially Adi's family, but also the team that had released the act of killing. They said, Adi's family, there had been, you see, such momentum for change, at least in the public discussion in Indonesia, following the act of killing's release. The act of killing helped catalyze, and I don't say it's the only thing that helped catalyze this, but it helped catalyze a kind of fundamental transformation that took place in 2012, 2013, in how the mainstream media in Indonesia, and the public as a whole, therefore, talk about the past. Whereas before, the media had been silent about the genocide with very few exceptions, or had even celebrated it as a kind of necessary extermination of the Indonesian left, the Indonesian Communist Party. Now they were talking about the genocide as a crime against humanity, and more importantly to me, really, because I think it's really what the two films are about, the media started talking about the criminal regime that's been in power in some form ever since the 1965 killings. And this transformation meant that there had ultimately been thousands of screenings of the act of killing around the country, and when the act of killing, and then after the screenings started to abate, we put the film online, where it was downloaded for free by tens of millions of Indonesians, downloaded and shared by tens of millions of Indonesians. And then when the film was nominated for an Academy Award, it prompted the president's spokesman, the former president's spokesman, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono's presidential spokesman, to say, look, we know what happened in 1965 was a crime against humanity. We know we need a truth and reconciliation process, but we don't need a film to push us to do this. And it was a kind of stupid and cowardly statement that was trying to dismiss the film, but it was still wonderful because it was one of the only times in many years that anyone at that level had said what happened was wrong, or implied that what happened was wrong. And it was against that backdrop of a space opening up for public discussion that the team and Adi's family felt the film should come out. So Adi's family said, we're happy to move to Denmark. The team that released the act of killing in Indonesia said, in fact, we think there's been sufficient change that if the family moves to another part of Indonesia, and if we can raise enough sufficient resources to sort of assemble a robust team to monitor the family's safety, Adi and the family can probably stay in Indonesia and play a crucial role in the release of the film there, and consequently in the kind of movement for truth, justice, and reconciliation that we hope the film will catalyze or energize. And that's in the end what's happened. There's a team of 5 people working full-time and another 15 people now working part-time to ensure Adi and his family's safety. They're living in another part of the country. We've raised, it was more expensive, in fact, to organize this safe release of the film than it was to make the film. The children are in better schools. We've raised a scholarship fund for the children to go to whatever university they should wish, if they would want to go to universities, and for Adi to both buy a home and open a brick-and-mortar optometry store so that the family no longer has to live hand-to-mouth, going door-to-door testing people's eyes. Adi, the premiere of The Look of Silence happened, it's not quite a year ago tomorrow. Today's November 9th? So a year ago tomorrow, November 10th, 2014, which happens to be a stupid holiday, National Heroes Day. And I say it's a stupid holiday because I really think, and I hope you'll just reflect on this for a moment, that Oscar Wilde was absolutely right when he said that patriotism is the virtue of the vicious. And on National Heroes Day, entering the space opened by the act of killing, something unimaginable previously happened. 2 government bodies, the National Human Rights Commission and the Jakarta Arts Council, hosted the premiere of the film. And they put up billboards around Jakarta announcing the film and placed it in Indonesia's largest theater, a venue for 1,500 people. 3,000 people came to the screening. They put on 2 screenings so that everyone could see the film. Adi came to both screenings as a surprise guest and received this incredible response from the audience. And trending on Twitter that day across Indonesia and consequently around the world, because in fact Indonesia is the world's largest Twitter-using country, was today we have a new national hero and his name is Adi Rukun. A month later, the film came out around the country with 500 public screenings on the first day, December 10th, and that's why November 10th had been chosen. It was a month before December 10th, which is International Human Rights Day. And on the same day, Senator Tom Udall introduced a Senate resolution saying that the United States must also acknowledge its role in this genocide by declassifying all of the documents which would reveal what we did. The CIA job documents, the defense attaché documents, the vast majority of which remain classified, and those that have been declassified, wherever there's any relevant information, they remain heavily redacted by black magic marker. So on this date, December 10th, the film came out in Indonesia, and by now, with 500 screenings, by now there's been over 4,000 screenings and all over the country, in every province. And from the reports back from the people who organized the screenings, these screenings, I should say, have built on the network of community groups, film clubs, universities, NGOs, more progressive churches and mosques that showed the act of killing, built on and expanded that group, that network. From the reports back from people who've organized screenings, we estimate that 350,000 people have seen the film in screenings. On December 10th, the film will become available for Indonesians for free online, just as the act of killing did, and that number will go into the millions. Now this reaction to the film, this very positive reaction, what you can say first happened, I suppose, just before I move on from this, is that into the space opened by the act of killing came this second film. If the first film had come like The Child in the Emperor's New Clothes and sort of pointed at something in a way everybody knew or suspected to be the case, that something unimaginably horrible happened, and said, look at the crime against humanity that transpired, and look at the criminal regime that's still in power, the corruption that's flourished, because the society has been in some way or another in the grips of fear. They haven't been able to challenge the military, the paramilitaries, the oligarchs effectively to end the rampant corruption which has flourished ever since the military took over and ever since the genocide in 1965. If that's what the first film pointed out. It did so like The Child in the Emperor's New Clothes, and then it pointed out something everyone knew. Look, the king is naked. Well, everyone knew the king was naked, but had been too afraid to say it before. into that space has come the second film, also like The Child in the Emperor's New Clothes, I think also pointing at something that people fundamentally know, which is that there's huge areas of public discussion that are dangerous to talk about, that people are divided by this, people are sort of divided from their neighbors by fear and guilt, that every Indonesian is in a sense being condemned or asked to raise their children in a kind of partial prison of fear. And people know this, and it's painful to talk about, and it's humiliating to talk about. And this film comes and shows it, and has made it impossible for people who've seen the film not to talk about it, and not to, as we hope, demand truth, justice, and reconciliation. And many, many more Indonesians still need to see the film before a true movement were to gather, and I don't think a film alone is enough to catalyze a movement. The discussion has to grow, the activism has to grow. But in response to the impact that the Look of Silence had, in response to the larger release that the Look of Silence had, even compared to the act of killings, there's been a backlash from the military. And you see the military, it's I think important to say that the military effectively, in some way, is sovereign in Indonesia. Even 17 years after the end of formal military dictatorship, if a military general goes into a village and has the entire village massacred, he cannot be put on trial in a civilian court. The only way he could face justice is if Parliament were to convene a special human rights court, something it's never done fairly or effectively despite decades of ongoing human rights abuse since 1965, and which continues to some extent in West Papua, where there's ongoing torture of detainees and political prisoners. There's still political prisoners and extrajudicial executions. This military general could either face an ad hoc human rights court convened by the parliament, which doesn't happen, or the military could convene its own tribunal to try the general, which means the military would have to decide to punish itself. And effectively, therefore, the military is above the law. And when the military, the institution with the greatest capacity for violence in a society, is above the law, inevitably, a shadow state forms around it, consisting of its paramilitary groups who do its dirty work, intelligence organizations like the Badan Intelijen Negara and other military intelligence bodies. And this shadow state effectively becomes sovereign in that when it threatens, when it makes noise, every single time, the elected government demurs and defers to it. And see, starting in the early months of last year, as the rollout of the Look of Silence gathered momentum, the military started hiring thugs to go and threaten and attack screenings, and would use these threats as an excuse to demand that screenings be canceled. And about 40 screenings were canceled that way before a group of students in Yogyakarta bravely barricaded themselves inside the campus and went ahead with the screening despite threats. And that was so well positively reported in the nation's media that I think the military decided that this was a losing strategy. And the military sort of backed off. But on October 1st, the 50th anniversary of the start of the 1965 killings, there started to be a kind of crackdown on freedom of expression in Indonesia dealing with the 1965 killings. So a man named Tom Ilyas, a Swedish citizen, Indonesian, who became a refugee to Sweden in 1965, and whose father was killed in a mass grave, went back finally, after all these decades, after 50 years, to Indonesia to find his parents' graves. And when he approached with a camera to take pictures for his children in Sweden, his father's grave, the mass grave, he was arrested, roughed up, detained for several days, deported, and blacklisted, so he can never return to Indonesia. Screenings were canceled over those days. A screening at the Jakarta Theological Seminary was met with 70 police officers who came saying they were there to watch the film, but actually were there to intimidate them into canceling the screening. Meanwhile, a kilometer away, the chief of police in Jakarta joined the kind of fascist, right-wing Islamist organization of thugs, the Front Pembela Islam, the Islamic Defenders Thug, which is very similar actually to Pancasila Youth, and I think to the organization you see in the act of killing, the chief of police hosted this thug screening of the government propaganda film that you see in the act of killing, and said, we must crack down on further screenings of Senyap, which is the Indonesian title of The Look of Silence. That was on October 1st, that was September 30th. Then, just 2 weeks ago, Southeast Asia's probably most important literary and cultural event, the Ubud Writers and Readers Festival in Bali, was the organizers were threatened with arrest if they went ahead with a screening of The Look of Silence and with a Skype appearance by me, and 8 panel discussions dealing with the 1965 killings were canceled. There's a kind of crackdown on freedom of expression now, and there's outrage about it, and what the film has done in a sense is expose this rift between the shadow state, the military on the one hand, and the democratic aspirations, I think, of many of the people of Indonesia in the elected state, even though many of the institutions of the elected state are ultimately afraid of the military and the shadow state, and will ultimately defer to it. So at the moment we're living in a kind of uncertain and unfortunate moment. I hope all of you, I think that if the United States were to break its silence about its role in the killings, it would make it harder for the Indonesian government to maintain its official silence. It's important to recognize that the 1965 killings, as you saw, got into important and I think damning intimations of in the film tonight, that the 1965 killings are not just Indonesian history, but also American history. You heard a paramilitary leader say to you, because he spoke to the camera, to me, to my lens, and therefore directly to you, that what happened that he deserves a cruise, a present, a trip to America, because America taught him to hate and kill the communists. And I think even more importantly, recall the NBC documentary where you saw Goodyear almost praised for harvesting the latex that goes into its tires, using slaves drawn from death camps. This is, of course, exactly what German corporations were doing on the periphery of Auschwitz only 20 years earlier. And German radio, in fact, did not celebrate the use of slave labor during the Nazi times. But here, NBC, on American television, is speaking in kind of sunny or admiring terms of Goodyear using slaves. And this should lead each and every one of us to wonder, to what extent was American participation in the 1965 genocide really motivated by ideological anti-communism? Or rather, was ideological anti-communism a ruse, a pretext for the wholesale corporate plunder that followed, even if the policymakers sincerely believed in the excuse? You know, you can sincerely believe. There's a very important moment in the act of killing where Anwar Congo and Adi Zulkadri watched that propaganda film that the government produced and that they made every child watch. And I asked, what do you think of this? And Adi Zulkadri says, of course it's a lie, we know it's a lie. And Anwar Congo says, well, it might be a lie, but it's the one, and he says this with panic, he says, it might be a lie, but it's the one thing that makes me feel better about myself. Please don't shoot it down. Perhaps ideological anti-communism was that for so many American policymakers who got into politics with the help of their friends in business, who were then invited to come into Indonesia and divide the country up, as you've described it, Jeffrey Winters, in your book, Power in Motion. Divide the country up like a cake where different sectors of the economy were given to different American corporations. To what extent was ideological anti-communism the excuse that allowed our country to commit that act of evil? To what extent, in fact, does the human capacity for evil, in the collective and political sense as well as in the individual sense, depend on our ability to lie to ourselves? So I hope we'll recognize that so long as America remains silent about its role in human rights violations, the rest of the world will rightly consider our rhetoric criticizing other countries' human rights records as a hypocritical ruse or pretext for advancing American commercial and strategic interests. So we must break our own silence about this. Please, when you go home tonight, go to www.thelookofsilence.com/participate. It's easy to remember, it's just the name of the film.com, and you'll look for the banner for participate or take action or whatever. But there is this place where you can sign a petition urging your senators to support Tom Udall's resolution demanding that the United States declassify the details of its participation and take responsibility for its role in these crimes.